Right, hello and welcome back. This is a new topic today, and this first video is really just introducing the topic, and it really shouldn't take long at all. I'd be surprised if this runs any longer than 7 or 8 minutes. The topic is the ecosystems topic, and we're starting by looking at variation. It's a word that we use a lot, so we've really got to get our head around what variation actually is and the different types of variation. But here are the objectives as laid out by the book. We're going to recall what a species is, because quite often we talk about variation within a species. And then we're going to describe two types of variation, continuous or discontinuous. So we'll start with what a species is, because it is a word that we use all the time. You know, we talk about species of dogs, species of cats, species of whatever. But do we actually know how to properly define it? Well, it turns out that in general terms, to be part of the same species, you have to be able to breed, and your offspring also needs to be able to have the ability to reproduce. So, for example, if I took two poodles, they could breed together, and their offspring will be a poodle that could also breed with another poodle, and so on and so on. And there are exceptions to that rule. So, for example, if I show you the horse and the zebra, they are not part of the same species, but they can breed, and they can breed and produce this little fella here, which we call a zebroid. Now, the thing about a zebroid is it cannot reproduce itself, right? It's not fertile. So a horse and zebra, although they can reproduce together, are not classed as being the same species, because when they do reproduce, their offspring are infertile. And I think also a horse and a donkey can reproduce and create a mule, which again will be infertile. It won't be able to reproduce. Now, when you produce something like a mule or a zebroid, we call those hybrids. So when members of two different species breed together to produce an infertile offspring, that infertile offspring is called a hybrid. So that's our summary of what a species is. We're always going to find exceptions to the rule in the animal kingdom, as with everything. But in general, species are, or to be members of the same species, you must be able to reproduce, and your offspring needs to be fertile and also able to reproduce. So once we have a species and they've all reproduced, and there's lots of them, we're going to have variation. And if I ask you to name differences between people, which essentially is what variation is, you could do it very easily. You could talk about hair length, eye colour, weight, hand span, foot size, right? So many different things you could mention. In fact, we've got a list here in one of the questions. Now, with variation, it's important to understand that it can come from two different sources. Variation can come from our parents. It can be inherited in our genes, in our DNA. So if our parents both have blue eyes, for example, it's quite likely that we will end up having blue eyes. Not definite, but it's quite likely. We're going to gain lots of our features from our parents, and that will be inherited variation. But then through our lifetime, we can change things about our body that are independent of what our parents have given us. So, for example, what do I mean by that? I mean that I've made the decision to keep my hair short. I cut my hair short. I'm not bald, right? I cut it short with some clippers. So my hair length is different to somebody else's hair length. That's a variation, right? It's a difference. But I'm choosing to do that myself. We call that an environmental variation. Weight can also be affected by environmental factors. You know, if I choose to eat 10 donuts every day for breakfast, I'm going to have a different body weight or body fat to someone that chooses to eat 10 apples every day for breakfast. So not all our differences are inherited. And what we find is as we get older and older, those environmental factors kind of build up, if you like. And even identical twins can end up looking quite differently when they're a lot older, if they've lived a very different life. So we do have, to summarise, variation being inherited or environmental, but they weren't the key words that were on the learning objective. The key words were continuous or discontinuous. And I'm going to have to ask you to imagine we're in our little virtual classroom as I try and tell you the differences between these. Right. We'll start with natural eye colour. Is that an example of continuous or discontinuous? Well, how would we find that out? Well, I want you to imagine you are in your classroom with all your classmates. And I, as a science teacher, send everybody that's got blue eyes to that corner of the room, everybody that's got brown eyes to that corner of the room, everybody that's got green eyes to that corner, and everybody that's not sure or has got a different colour to that corner of the room. How would that room look? Right? It would look as if I had 4 completely separate groups of child. Right? I've split you into groups. Just bear that in mind. Let's go to having a scar. How might I deal with that in classroom? I might say, if you have a scar anywhere, I want you to go to this side of the room. If you've not got a scar, I want you to go to that side of the room. Think about how that classroom would look. Yet again, I've split the class into separate groups. The same with having a tattoo. One group over here, one group over there. I've split you into groups. Hair colour would be the same. Stand in that corner for brown hair, stand in that corner for black hair, stand in that corner for blonde hair, and so on. I am splitting you into groups. Now, when you can do that with a type of variation, we call that discontinuous variation. As you get older, you might hear the word categoric variation, putting you into categories, right? Categoric categories. But for now, discontinuous is a term we're going to use. Not all variations are discontinuous. So let me give you an example here. Length of hair. If I asked everybody to stand up and order themselves from the shortest hair, right, to the longest hair, I would no longer have separate groups. I would have just one group that everybody was a part of. The shortest hair over this end, the longest hair over this end, but anybody could walk in off the street into that classroom and put themselves somewhere in that one group we've created. They can put themselves at the end, they can put themselves at the middle, depending on the length of the hair. But I would only have one group, a continuous line. I could do that with age. I could do that with body weight. Everybody has a body weight. I could put the lightest to the heaviest, and whoever walked in that door could put themselves somewhere in that line. There'd be no need to create a separate group. Okay? Now, when you've got variation like that, we call it continuous, because everybody's on a continuous line, a spectrum, if you like. And if we just have a look at all of these, we should hopefully instinctively be able to put these into those different types of variations. So eye colour, different groups would be discontinuous. Length of hair, continuous. Having a scar, discontinuous. Right, you've either got one or you haven't. Having a tattoo, discontinuous. You've either got one or you haven't. Hair colour, discontinuous. You're either blonde or brown. Having a cold, you've either got one or you haven't. Discontinuous. In fact, the only one here that is continuous is length of hair. So can we think of any others that are continuous? We could have height, I think we've already said. We could have the handspan. Quite often in school, when I'm teaching this, I'll get you to measure the span of your thumb to your finger. We'll get everybody in a line based on handspan, etc. Now, shoe size is an interesting one. I use that word interesting loosely. Shoe size and foot size are different things. Foot size would be a continuous variation. Everybody could line up with the different size feet from the smallest feet to the biggest feet. And there will be a continuous spectrum. But if I used shoe size, well, that suddenly becomes discontinuous. Because for shoe size, you're either 9, 9.5, 10, 10.5, 11, right? Or whatever sizes they do these days. If we're doing European sizes, I don't know. But there is no 9.367 shoe size. There is no size 9.582, okay? You have to have separate groups when you're looking at shoe size. But the size of your foot, that's continuous. So that's an interesting one to think about. Again, I say I use that word interesting loosely. Some worksheets will be sent your way based on this. All I want you to do from this video is to be able to define what species is and give an example of exceptions to the rule. Can you define what a hybrid is and give an example? And are you comfortable with the idea of continuous versus discontinuous variation? One last thing on continuous and discontinuous variation. When we are given data to plot in a graph, Continuous variation, so if I was plotting heights or so, would always be put on a line graph or a scatter graph with a line of best fit. Discontinuous or categoric variation is almost always represented as a bar chart. A lot of times when I'm asking people to plot a graph, one of the first questions they ask me is, what type of graph am I doing? Right, and that's a skill we've got to develop as we're going forward. We've got to be able to decide for ourselves the best way of representing data, and that's a really good rule to stick to. That continuous data, it tends to be a line graph or a scatter graph, and discontinuous tends to be a bar chart. Anyway, I'll be back for the next lesson. Thank you very much.